These things are always really satisfying when we come away learning something that we didn't know. And that's what's about to happen next as we come to our final panel of the day. We are very fortunate to have 3 University of Toronto doctoral candidates to talk about their research. Now they have promised me that they're not going to go too wonky on us, but there might be some very interesting stuff come out of this. It's cutting edge research. You've met earlier today some of the rock stars of the Prohibition, anti-Prohibition movement from the 20th century, and you're about to meet some of the eminent rock stars from the 21st century, the researchers who will be pushing the margins of our knowledge and teaching us what we need to know as we roll forward into a new cannabis regime. So, quick introduction. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. In the middle here is Jenna Valleriani, a PhD student studying the intersection between social movements, entrepreneurship, and the medical cannabis industry. Rebecca Penn, hold up your hand, Rebecca, a doctoral candidate studying the social construction of knowledge and expertise in drug policy, to which I say, ooh. Let's go full geek. And finally, Katrina Kolar, a doctoral candidate working on marijuana use through the lens of drug normalization framework. Jenna, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Jenna, and as you mentioned, I'm at the University of Toronto. So kind of where I come from is about a year and a half ago, I started some research at a medical cannabis dispensary in Toronto. And then I kind of transitioned doing patient intake, so orientations and education. So one of the things I'm really interested in looking at is, what's happening to dispensaries under the new regulations. And I'm interested in comparing what's happening in BC, particularly Vancouver, versus Ontario. Oh. Okay. So the kind of broad idea that I'm looking at is this kind of connection between social movements and entrepreneurship in an emerging new industry. So this is something that really nobody has really looked at. There's been a few people in kind of more recent years. And even more recently, a lot of people have been saying, we need to pay attention to the geography of social movements. So basically that's premised under the idea that although there could be this really big movement across Canada geared towards medical cannabis access, it's made up of so many organizations and so many people and so many groups that everyone kind of has a different idea of what an ideal outcome is within the movement. So for some people, if we're talking more generally, let's say about the reform of marijuana laws, for some people that could mean decriminalization. For others, that means legalization. And then within that, we could say, okay, what does legalization mean to everyone? For some people, it's re-regulation. For some people, it's an open market model. So what I want to do is kind of trace how the distinct histories of how the movement unfolded in BC and Ontario are kind of contributing to the different outcomes or the different ways that dispensaries are adapting in Canada. So my dorky academic question is actually, how do provincial differences in first the introduction of the social movement to medical cannabis, as well as the attitudes of cannabis use, shape the trajectory of dispensaries? So I think it's going to lead to different interactions, and this could be something exclusive to Vancouver, but that's something that I wanted to kind of keep open until I start my research. So I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but the medical cannabis dispensaries kind of came up as a response to an unmet need to safe access and knowledge about medicating with cannabis. And they provide access to a range of medical marijuana products to individuals with a diagnosed medical condition. And they operate as an act of civil disobedience. So some people will say they operate in a gray area, they operate outside of the law, and basically that just means they were never included, they were never part of the MMAR, and they're not part of the MMPR. So these are people that have kind of risked their liberty to kind of operate dispensaries on behalf, for other patients. And law enforcement has generally tolerated these best practice dispensaries, so the kind of legalities of them gets really confusing for people because they operate kind of quasi-legally within communities all over Canada. So dispensaries under the new regulations, and to a lot of people's disappointment, they weren't actually included in the MMPR, so the dispensary model was not included. And under the new regulations, the dispensary model is less supported. So kind of what I mean by that is under Health Canada's legal supply channel, medical patients could only get access to one strain. And you know, we know that each strain has its own therapeutic profile and effect. So that's kind of where cannabis dispensaries stepped in and give patients access to a variety of different strains. But now Health Canada might just point to LPs and kind of say, you know, they're providing a range of different strains, theoretically. And also, it's confounded with the fact of mandatory minimums. So the climate of operating dispensaries is more risky, right? Because we have mandatory minimums associated with trafficking, with possession with the intent of trafficking, with production. So that just makes it a bit more risky to continue operations. So how are dispensaries going to adapt? So I've been kind of tracing about 4 outcomes that I've seen so far. The 2 most obvious being, you know, they're going to stay open. Some of them are going to stay open, and others are going to close. So this could be a voluntary closure, or it could also mean kind of an intense, like, kind of legal effort to start closing dispensaries at a quicker pace across Canada. So one dispensary I spoke to that's staying open actually said, the various programs that Health Canada has tried has all been lacking in our view and the view of the courts. Still, we've been risking arrest every day, and we'll continue our civil disobedience until our membership no longer needs us. Nothing's really changed for us. There was really only one question. Does the federal program meet the needs of our members? And the answer we came back with was no. So that was just to kind of give you an idea. Another 2 outcomes that we're seeing is that these dispensaries are changing organizational forms. So basically what I mean by that is some dispensaries are actually transitioning to be licensed producers under the MMPR, and others are kind of retooling their operations in ways where they're becoming just a resource center or an education center. So they're not going to be dispensing anymore, but they're going to focus on things like patient support, education, and resources. So one dispensary I talked to that's turning into a resource center said, we're cautiously optimistic about the MMPR, but we oppose the repeal of provisions in the MMAR which allow patients to produce their own supply. But we'll be shutting down March 31st and retooling our operations. We made this decision based on several factors, namely the improved quality controls that LPs will be required to meet, and an increased capacity to do research under the new rules. I think dispensaries are split on what to do, and they're going to wait and see how the industry develops before making any drastic decisions. It doesn't mean there won't be chaos in the meantime. So what I'm really interested in is seeing what's happening in BC and Ontario, and it's becoming increasingly clear that what's happening in BC seems very unique to Vancouver in particular. I chose these 2 sites because most of the well-established dispensaries are located in BC or Ontario, and they present the highest number of legally authorized Canadians within those provinces to use medical cannabis. So this is actually triggered by a conversation I had with Jamie Shaw from the BC Compassion Club Society, and she said, you know, outside of Vancouver, there appears to be a lot of fear surrounding the new regulations in general, and not just among dispensaries. Some dispensaries have closed, some applied to be an LP, and some plan on continuing its operations. In Vancouver, it's a very different story. We've seen more dispensaries open in the last few months than in the decade of our existence. So this was really interesting, and it made me to kind of stop and think about what kind of entrepreneurial outcomes I was thinking about. I was strictly thinking in terms of, you know, these LPs opening up, but in Vancouver, there seems to be something really different going on that certainly isn't happening in Ontario. In Ontario, a lot of them seem to be kind of closing or have plans of closing or are transitioning. So what accounts for these kind of differences that we're seeing? So one of the ideas is that there's a different climate of tolerance. So things like the Vancouver Police Department has said they won't go after best practice in well-established dispensaries, versus places like Toronto, where there doesn't seem to be a strong consensus across the city, and even knowledge about the federal program kind of varies station to station. We also know that more generally, BC is known for its more relaxed attitude towards recreational cannabis use. So kind of this kind of cultural element can come into play in terms of what outcomes we're seeing. And BC, particularly obviously focused on Vancouver, is also known for its progressive approach in the drug policy realm. So I have pictures of, that's meant to be the 4-pillar strategy, Sensible BC, and probably the most famous being Insight. And I think it really comes down to the movement as well, because BC is often cited as kind of the home of this original kind of grassroots movement for medical cannabis access. And the first Compassion Club opened in Vancouver in '97. And much of the current research and advocacy groups kind of come out of BC, and that's something that we see here today with the amount of people that have come out from out west to be here today. So for me, the next step is to kind of collect these interviews with dispensary owners and directors and those involved in cooperatives across BC and Ontario. I want to find out what they're doing and what kind of informs the decisions that they're making. And I'm going to be visiting BC for a month in the fall to hopefully collect the first round of interviews. And I wanted to kind of leave you with some food for thought, kind of a more dorky or academic question I've been thinking about is, you know, what's going to happen when a movement of activists have to give way to a market of entrepreneurs? And what's going to happen when we blend these kind of movement values with an emerging new market and the economic principles of for-profit businesses? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Penn and I am at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And I'm a social scientist, and my areas of interest have really focused on ideas around construction of knowledge. So questions like, what counts as knowledge? Whose knowledge counts? And what are the different forms of knowledge that are seen as legitimate and credible? I'm also really interested in ideas about expertise. Who gets to be seen as an expert? Who are the stakeholders that get invited to the table and get to participate in public policy processes? I found that the medical cannabis debate was a really interesting way of exploring these interests. And like Jenna, I've been very interested in the ideas of social movements, and particularly how that relates to the medical cannabis activism. What I found particularly exciting is to see how activists have stepped up to address the need for access to medical cannabis in the face of the Canadian government's reluctance. They've really pushed the Canadian government to develop policies for the provision of medical cannabis, and they keep challenging the government to create policies for a safe legal supply that actually meets the needs of patients. But they've also done more than this. A lot of medical cannabis activists have been involved in establishing new expertise and new knowledge about medical cannabis and a model for its distribution, as well as new models for research, knowledge production, and more generally, the provision of health services. And social scientists really enjoy categorizing things. So one way of categorizing social movements is to think about them as embodied health movements. And I think this is a framework that fits the medical cannabis movement very well. By thinking about movements in different ways, it really highlights specific features of movements and helps us to see how they've been successful, what resources activists have drawn upon, what activities have they engaged in that have allowed them to contribute to change. And so we can learn from that in order to advance more change. So like I say, I think the type of social movement that fits the medical cannabis movement the best is one called an embodied health movement. And this is because medical cannabis activists have really mobilized patients and their lived experiences of their illness, as well as the therapeutic properties of cannabis, to push medical cannabis onto the research and policy agendas. Before I go on, I'm going to really quickly review the medical cannabis regulations in Canada and describe community-based dispensaries. And then I'll take you through the key features of what we call an embodied health movement to highlight the success of activists. So in 2001, Canada became the first country to provide a framework for the approved or for approved patients to legally access cannabis for medicinal purposes. And Health Canada's regulations really came about because of court rulings that found the prohibition of cannabis for patients to be a violation of their constitutional rights. And regulations have continued to be challenged in the courts as failing to address the needs of patients. And this has led to the establishment of the new regulatory framework that came into effect in April. And of course, court battles are continuing. Under the new framework, physicians can prescribe cannabis to patients directly, and patients send in the prescriptions to licensed producers who then mail the cannabis to the patient. Community-based dispensaries remain illegal. Activists and patients have cited concerns about this new framework, particularly in terms of access, equity, affordability, and quality of care. Dispensaries have been operating in Canada since 1997, and it's hard to know exactly how many community-based, nonprofit dispensaries are currently operating because of their illegal status and the lack of regulations. But we can estimate that there's about 50, and they serve about 30,000 patients. And although prosecution is rarely successful, police raids and court procedures continue to disrupt the efforts of dispensaries. In addition to providing medical cannabis, dispensaries also provide patients with education and support. They're also engaged in advocacy and in research. And in 2012, an association was formed, CAMCD, and CAMCD has the goal of promoting a regulated, community-based approach to medical cannabis, its distribution, and also to support medical cannabis dispensaries to provide the highest quality of patient care. One of the activities of CAMCD, or one of the things that they're involved in right now, is an accreditation process trying to advance best practices for community-based dispensaries. It's important to know that there's many different models of dispensaries, and they have different goals and different interests. And today what I'm talking about are community-based dispensaries that are nonprofit and patient-centered. So embodied health movements, they're really just social movements that are organized efforts to challenge knowledge and practice about the causes, treatments, and prevention of disease. And they've got three characteristics. First, they emphasize the importance of people's lived experience. So they care about what people's lives are like and how their bodies work and what they experience physically, emotionally. They also challenge existing medical and scientific knowledge and practice. And another feature is that activists collaborate with scientists, health professionals, and policymakers. I think these are really critical features of the medical cannabis movement, and I think activists have been very successful in using these features and characteristics to promote change in the area of medical cannabis in Canada. So the first characteristic is this emphasis on lived experience. In order to stimulate change, you need to mobilize people and resources. And one of the ways of doing this is to find common ground between people who are affected by the issue. And one way is to establish a collective identity. And typically in health movements, identities are around a specific disease category. For example, breast cancer survivors or people with multiple sclerosis. But with medical cannabis, there are many different conditions that people have where they turn to use medical cannabis. So I suggest that this collective identity is based on a couple of things. One is that they do have a personal lived experience of an illness with symptoms that are not satisfactorily treated or managed using conventional therapies. And the second piece is that they find that cannabis works. It helps them. And so the next step is that you've got this idea, everybody comes together and shares this experience, but then it needs to be politicized. It needs to be brought to the attention of the public. And the way this is usually done is by experiencing experiencing inequality, having the perception that the conditions that they experience contradict scientific and medical explanations. And this is a source of inequality. And what we see with medical cannabis, cannabis patients, is that cannabis is seen as a dangerous drug by policymakers and the medical establishment, whereas patients experience it as therapeutic. So there's a disconnect there, and that's a source of inequality because patients come to be seen as criminals. So activists have really worked to change the perception of both cannabis as a drug, from an illicit drug to a therapeutic substance, as well as changing the image of medical cannabis users from being criminals to being patients who are deserving of care and compassion. So the second characteristic of this health movement is that the challenge is existing medical and scientific knowledge and practice. And one of the things that activists do is they really push back against science, in that they judge science based on intimate first-hand knowledge of their bodies and their illnesses. So that's how they evaluate and assess the science. And medical cannabis activists have really done this. They've challenged scientific, medical, and political communities about what makes it on the research agenda, what counts as research, how research is conducted, and who benefits from the research. And policymakers often cite a lack of rigorous, randomized, controlled trials and the lack of conclusive research as reasons for their hesitancy to change the status of cannabis from Schedule I to Schedule II substance. But at the same time, they're not funding research, and they're not offering support for this research. For example, in 2001, when the MMAR came out, the Health Canada did announce a plan for a research program for medical cannabis. And it was a 5-year plan, $7.5 million, but there were only 3 clinical trials that were approved, and all the funding was canceled by 2006, thereby ending the program. So while policymakers and medical professionals are concerned about the lack of evidence and say that without this evidence we can't support medical cannabis, they're also not doing the research or funding the research. And what's been really exciting and interesting to me is how medical cannabis activists have worked to fill this gap and conduct their own research. And they've been in a really unique position to do this, and they've taken advantage of that position. For example, they've got a very high quality supply of medical cannabis, of multiple strains that aren't typically found in other research facilities. And dispensaries have members who are willing to participate in this research. They're willing to talk about their experiences and get involved in research. And one example of a study is one that was done a few years ago by the Vancouver Island Compassion Society. It was a symptom strain survey that asked members to share their experiences with different strains, and they were able to document to find what strains helped what symptoms. And the results of the survey provided staff with information that allowed them to more confidently recommend the use of indicas for pain relief and sativas for nausea and loss of appetite. But the problem is that these studies are observational, and on this hierarchy of what counts as knowledge, the results of observational studies are just not given the same weight as the findings of randomized control trials. It doesn't count as evidence in the same way. This is not the evidence that policymakers are looking for. So this led to the collaboration of community-based dispensaries with researchers, health professionals, and policymakers. Activists really quickly realized the need to participate in the peer review process, for example, in order to have their studies deemed as credible by the scientific and policy communities. So they partnered with university researchers, and an example again from the Vancouver Island Compassion Society was a study that was done in partnership with a researcher from University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Silvestre. And that study was the first one to take place in a community-based dispensary in partnership with the university that was peer-reviewed. So medical cannabis activists have become activist experts by partnering with scientists, researchers, and health professionals. And they learn the language and the culture of experts in order to establish legitimacy and credibility, really in order to learn how to play by the rules of that game and that world. Looking at medical cannabis activism using this lens of embodied health movement really highlights how people's lived experience has been harnessed to contribute to the knowledge about the therapeutic benefits of medical cannabis. And it also contributes to the debate about how to best provide medical cannabis to patients. And arguably, activists have been very successful. The model of community-based dispensaries addresses many of the concerns that have arisen with the Health Canada framework, including cost, security, and quality, while also adding additional services, such as education, healthcare, and support. But despite this, the federal government has not adopted this model, nor made any changes to the legal status of dispensaries. The federal government's continued ambivalence towards medical cannabis and the refusal to adopt a community-based dispensary model suggests an approach to federal decision-making where politics trumps science. In the meantime, activists keep the issue on the agenda. They keep on challenging the medical, scientific, and political institutions by creating new knowledge and advancing new approaches to healthcare and research. Thank you.
That's not my presentation. There we go. Hi everybody, my name is Kat. I am a sociology student at the University of Toronto. I'd like to thank you all for having us here today and sitting down, taking some time to listen. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the drug normalization framework, which is what my research is based on. And this presentation is split up into 3 parts. I hope I don't bore you too much. So the first is a breakdown of the drug normalization framework, which I will try to keep sweet and simple so I can get to the more fun stuff. Then I'll talk about changing historical depictions of women, especially in relationship to cannabis. And then I'll provide a gender-focused exploration of drug acceptability around cannabis. And this will all come together as I explain the drug normalization framework. So the drug normalization framework is about the study of changing attitudes and norms and behaviors around drug use. And this framework has 5 general components. The first is drug trying rates, so how these have changed over time, availability and accessibility, and the social accommodation of sensible drug use, which is also known as drug acceptability. That's the part that I generally focus on in my research. And drug acceptability seeks to identify the ways that drug use and non-use are perceived as meaningful, tolerable, or inappropriate among specific groups and in particular contexts. Drug acceptability is about exploring how drug use is situated in people's everyday lives. And so what counts as sensible drug use is contextual, it's relative. The last 2 components, cultural accommodation and policy shifts, are about bringing attention to the changing public profile of particular drugs. So, for example, marijuana, the risk perception profile of marijuana has been changing in Canada with the emergence and relative success of the medical marijuana movement, as well as with the recent legislative changes in the United States, which have put pressure on politicians to move away from a prohibition framework. The drug normalization framework is based on the work of Howard Parker in Britain from the 1990s onwards, where he tracked a group of British youth for about 17 years to look at changes in drug attitudes and use patterns. The framework helps to show how perspectives on drug users as either deviant or normal changes over the type of drug, over patterns of use, and over time. And so in exploring these diverse facets of recreational drug use, the normalization framework holds great potential to contribute to our understanding of drug trends and drug career trajectories of individuals. So why a gender-based analysis? Well, the vast majority of research on women's drug use has solely focused on negative health and social consequences, and research is needed which doesn't conceptualize women's drug use as inherently problematic, and particularly it's necessary for enhancing knowledge on the varied nature of women's participation in drug worlds. Drug use has been historically very gendered, both in patterns of use and in representations of drug users. And implicit in the drug normalization framework that I'm using, gender differences in drug use are assumed to be decreasing, yet the norms of drug use, despite changing patterns, continue to be highly gendered, and I'll illustrate this in some of my presentation. So, we've got marijuana girl. Mad, bad, or sad is the typical representation of women from the 1950s. As I outlined previously, one of the components of the drug normalization framework looks at changing cultural accommodation and representation of drug users. So here we see that the historical representation of women who use cannabis has been associated here with pleasure, drugs, loss of self-control, and succumbing to the pits of moral depravity. Here's some more examples. Women here are sensationalized, sexualized, and highly vulnerable to the pot. The themes of these representations are connected to white slavery panics of the early 1900s that associated women's drug use with vulnerability to sexual exploitation and moral depravity. More contemporary representations, we have the stiletto stoners, which has removed the vulnerability and moral depravity representation and replaced it with a sexual desirability and assertiveness and a sense of self-control. But obviously the sexualization that harkens back to those panics has carried over to contemporary representations. We're seeing a proliferation of representations of women who smoke marijuana as more conventional, so not these sexualized representations which are co-occurring. What's interesting about these images of women, particularly the woman on the right, is that these women are basically boring, right? There's nothing sexualized or crazy about them. And that's a new kind of depiction of women and drug use. And we have some of the central players in the medical marijuana advocacy movement. That is the representation of moms in major media in relationship to marijuana. Moms have played a central role in advocacy and in shifting media representations and public perceptions of marijuana. Their caregiving role is what has given them a strength in making claims about the enhancement of well-being and protecting families in opposition to the prohibition of marijuana. So what's important about this caregiving role is that it allows them to reverse conservative arguments for criminalization in two major ways. So moms counter these pro-criminalization arguments by saying, firstly, kids need medications and medical marijuana medications, and this allows them to counter the conservative claim that these drugs inherently harm children. Secondly, moms can argue that kids are not being protected from drug dealers, and they also argue that families are being torn apart by the violent crime and prison sentences that are arising from the Prohibition framework. So what's brilliant about this is that they're using conservative arguments against conservatives themselves in order to lobby for a change of marijuana laws. Go moms! Okay. So to the last part of my presentation, I'll be moving to look at some of the data that I gathered in interviews. So in the first part, I showed you how media representations of women who use cannabis are diversifying. And surveys have indicated that the gender gap appears to be closing between male and female cannabis use prevalence. And with this change, there has been a common assumption that stigma or norms of use and drug acceptability are lower among younger generations of cannabis users. But how true is this for young men and women? So I did 58 interviews with drug-using and non-using students at the University of Toronto, and non-using students are important in order to assess how attitudes towards drug users are changing. And we also did a survey of 1,227 students on their attitudes. And here I'm going to be focusing on three themes, or three gendered patterns in the data that help to explain differences between men's and women's use patterns. So these students indicated that men's and women's use diverges mostly at the two extremes. We've got more women who have never used and far more men who have used more often. So this is where the statistically significant differences are occurring at the outside ends of the graph. So what's interesting about this, so although there has been convergence in drug use trends, drugs continue to show differences in rates of use between men and women, especially at these higher and lowest rates of use. And now I'm going to turn to the interviews. I provide some block quotes as excerpts from the interviews just to show you what I'm doing with the data. So Salma says, I think girls mostly, well, the girls that I know, mostly do it in social settings if it's there. You don't really go out seeking it. You're not going to buy some for yourself. It's more so if it's available, then sure, let's smoke it. I think a lot of guys probably buy bulk from dealers and then they have it for their friends. Girls, if they're buying, I think it's small amounts at a time, like a gram or two. So the interviews, in combination with the surveys, indicate that there is ongoing gender stratification of access to cannabis, so women are not buying as frequently. There's ongoing supply-side stratification, which means that guys are generally dealers. Women tend to be occasional as opposed to frequent cannabis users, and women's cannabis use itself is often mediated by male partners. To talk about how their use is mediated by gender norms, I'm going to move on to the dating and desirability patterns in the data, as well as the self-control representation. So Janice says, I feel like more often the girls would judge the girls for smoking pot. Sometimes guys would judge the girls, like sometimes the guys, especially the non-users. They'll be like, oh, she's a pothead, I don't want to date her, or anything like that. So here Janice is talking about being afraid of being stigmatized for being a pot user and then not being desired. Similarly, Laura says, yeah, well, like I have dated someone who was against using cannabis and I stopped smoking it and I also stopped drinking when I was with him. But yeah, I would date someone who was against it. They'd probably make me quit, and that's, I guess, maybe a good thing. So it wouldn't ever affect my health. So the responses here suggest that women might experience heightened social pressures or may feel more stigmatized for smoking cannabis within intimate relationships. And in contrast to their female counterparts, male students expressed more indifference to whether a potential partner would disapprove of their cannabis use. So men as less reluctant to change their patterns than women are. And in discussing dating and relationships, women discussed feeling judged not just by male partners, but by other women as well. So these are trends in the data. This is not a uniform experience across the board. Several male students, including non-users, did say that they were not concerned by potential girlfriend's cannabis use. And this makes clear that there isn't a homogeneous experience of stigma, but these norms are patterned. So they are there, but they're not absolute. That's what we have to remember. So the last piece is the self-control theme. So women were admonished for having, first, too much self-control. So Joel here says, there are fewer regular stoners for females, there's less females that just every day that's what they're doing. At the same time, there are a lot of women who you wouldn't expect who use it once in a while. Why do you think there are fewer female stoners? Joel says, I generally see women as safer. I think they value their body maybe more. I know a lot of girls who don't like smoking bongs. They like to smoke joints, but that doesn't get you nearly as high. Also, I feel like women probably get it worse than guys when they're seen smoking. I guess it's more detrimental to their reputation, whereas guys, it's just not that big of a deal. Similarly, we have women being admonished for not having enough self-control. So for example, William says, like, I find that the majority of girls that I do smoke with don't smoke nearly as much as I do, or as my other friends, or are as experienced. When I do smoke with them, they get stoned, too stoned, right? To a point where I almost have to watch them, which I don't enjoy. It becomes more of me, like me babysitting them. And finally, we have the representation of women as exaggerating when they're high, as being manipulative for attention, basically. So Nadia says, girls act different when they smoke pot. Sometimes I've noticed girls exaggerate, like even when drinking. Girls act drunker than they are, like even if a girl hasn't drunk that much, she'll act like she's out of it. I've noticed girls doing that a lot. Why do you think girls do that instead of guys? Nadia says it's because of attention. So we see that women who exhibited excitable behavior are generally seen as attention-seeking in a negative way. And the lack of prominence of female stoners means that women's cannabis use might appear more noticeable or suspect to both users and non-users in terms of judging women. When women do smoke, they are judged for being either too loose, or they're stigmatized in their dating and desirability, or they have ulterior motives such as attention-seeking. So there seems to be a pervading critical orientation to women's cannabis use among students. The interviews and the survey indicate that there are ongoing gender-based differences in cannabis use norms, and this is the most normalized of drugs that are illicit, so we can imagine how this carries over to less normalized drugs as more extreme stigma. This insight also helps us to delve into why gender disparities in cannabis use rates are confined largely to the categories of frequent use and of non-use. Such findings also point us broadly to gender roles and self-regulation imperatives that might be sustaining differences in the frequency of drug use between men and women, and so highlight the ongoing importance of gender-based analyses of drug acceptability. So rather than concluding that gender-based differences in drug use are ending, although there has been considerable convergence, these findings suggest that only certain kinds of cannabis use have emerged as most acceptable for and to women, and that's relatively restrained cannabis use. It's going to be interesting to see how gender trends shift as policy shifts. For example, what will happen when gendered patterns of access, supply, and purchasing marijuana comes under a legal regulatory framework. So these things have changed in the past, as I've shown with the first part of my presentation, and they're likely also to change in the future. Thank you so much for listening.